What are the root causes of the European debt crisis?
I think to a large degree it reflects the unwinding of private sector imbalances in the Eurozone economies. Now, the picture is different country by country. With Greece, we know now that there was misreporting of data and that the fiscal position was much worse for much longer than anyone knew at the time. However, if we look at Ireland, Portugal and Spain, I think the question is much more one of the working out of private sector imbalances in those economies, including the bursting of housing bubbles and the closing of substantial current account deficits which had opened up under the single European monetary policy within the euro area. Now, the necessary offset of the bursting of property bubbles in these countries and the rise in private sector savings that we've seen has been a deterioration just within the national accounts, a deterioration in the public sector fiscal position, and that kind of natural offset is a large part of what's gone on.
Mm-hmm. Will China be the knight in shining armor coming to help the world economy this time?
I think you could make that case with regard to 2009, and we saw, if you look at the numbers for China, we see a collapse in export demand in that period, offset by a substantial rise in domestic demand within China, which to a large extent was driven by a very robust stimulus package that the Chinese authorities put in place at that time. Partly fiscal, but more through the banking system, and we saw very rapid credit growth, over 30% credit growth in 2009 and 2010. However, we're now living with the inflationary aftermath of that domestic demand stimulus, and that to some extent constrains China's options for responding to any further slowdown in the rest of the world, and hence in the export demand that the Chinese economy has. However, just to reiterate that we don't see a double dip, to use that term, as by any means a done deal.
Mm-hmm. How bad is Japan's economy?
Well, we think Japan's economy will be broadly flat this year, or perhaps marginally positive growth. Obviously, the tragic events of March were not constructive. However, we think that reconstruction efforts and the ongoing efforts of Japanese industry to work around supply problems caused by the earthquake and its aftermath, in particular to power supply, will lead to some rebound next year, and we think the economy might grow by around 2.5 to 3% next year. The longer term challenges facing Japan's public finances and sovereign credit, however, remain to be tackled, and that's something that we look for the new government and Mr. Noda to see what his strategy will be.
What about for the ASEAN Economic Community coming into the picture in 2015? What do you think the impact on the economy would be?
Well, I think the move towards freer trade in the region is something that would be positive for growth and for economic and therefore indeed sovereign credit fundamentals in the region. However, it's a relatively slow burn kind of factor that takes time to take its full to have its full impact.
Mm-hmm. Compared to other regions of the world, to say Europe or the US, how is Asia's economy doing in general? It's the bright spot, right, on the world map?
It is, but I don't think Asia has decoupled from the rest of the world. I think that final demand in the advanced economies remains the most important factor even for this region. Nonetheless, domestic demand is strengthening, reflecting the region's relatively strong fundamentals. So consumption demand and business capital spending in this region are holding up and have held up surprisingly well, partly because of stimulus within this region, not least from China, but also because of the region's relatively strong fundamentals, low levels of private sector debt, which has created the foundation for the region to not entirely shrug off, but to weather the headwinds from the rest of the world pretty well since 2008.
What's the outlook for Thailand for the rest of this year and maybe into next year?
I think Thailand, broadly speaking, shares the positive trends observed in most of the rest of the region. We think the economy might grow about 5% into next year. I think inflation is the main downside risk for Thailand, as for other countries in the region. I think it's encouraging that the impact on the economy from supply disruptions following the Japan disasters was pretty muted. So overall, the outlook remains bright with, as I say, just the niggle, I suppose, of inflation.
Mm-hmm. How should Thailand handle or prepare itself for a turbulent world economy?
Well, the best thing to do, or at least the thing that would be consistent with stronger sovereign creditworthiness, which is our concern, is to build up the buffers that would let the economy ride out the shocks, because obviously we don't know what the shocks will be, but we know that there will be some. We may not know what they are or how severe they will be, but we can be sure that shocks will come eventually at some point, and the thing that would be consistent with stronger sovereign creditworthiness and higher sovereign ratings would be to build up the buffers in terms of the sustainability of the fiscal position. The foreign currency reserves are already at a pretty generous level, and therefore should allow Thailand to ride out at least some of the global turbulence that we may expect.
People are talking about boosting domestic consumption rather than depending on exports, especially to Europe or to the US. Is that one way how we can mitigate the effects?
Yeah, I think that would be consistent with more decoupling, as we were talking about earlier. And I think it's interesting, if we look across the region, that many economies experienced a sharp decline in their rates of investment after the 97-98 Asian crisis, while savings have remained very strong.
Right.
As a counterpart, consumption has been fairly weak. So the region has become much more dependent on foreign demand rather than foreign savings for its overall economic and financial stability. So a strengthening in domestic demand, in particular consumption, would lessen dependence on the overall global economy and final demand from the still sluggish advanced economies, and that could support the stability of economic performance going forwards. One thing that would tend to strengthen domestic demand relative to exports, of course, would be to allow currencies to strengthen, and that's something that would also tend to restrain inflationary pressure.
Mm-hmm. Do you think rating agencies like Fitch, let's say, has too much power on the world economy? Whatever you rate, stocks go up, stocks go down.
I don't feel particularly powerful, I have to say. I think that it's important for us to continue to offer the best informed, independent credit judgment that we can, in conjunction with our, or in competition with of course, with the other firms, and for the market to make the best use of the ratings as it sees fit, and for market participants to continue, of course, to form their own views. I would hope using our credit views as a key input.
Mm-hmm. There's some criticism saying that all these rating agencies actually use data from the past, not very forward-looking.
Unfortunately, the data from the future haven't yet been published, so it's difficult for us to use them.
Uh-huh.
But more seriously, as I say, as I see our role, and as my colleagues I'm sure would agree, we use the broadest range of data that we can in informing our credit judgments, and I think the product still remains valued by market participants.
For consumers, what should we do with our money right now, in general?